That's the Austin GP done and dusted. That was a wonderful race. If you guys haven't watched it, at least do go watch the highlights. It did raise a fair few questions. Are the stewards biased? Who was at fault between Lando and Max? And were the 5-second penalty that Lando received justified? Does this race ultimately put a dent in the possibility that we could have a final showdown for a championship contention in Abu Dhabi? But most of all, is there a new force in town in terms of dominance in the name of Ferrari? Welcome to the channel, you folks. My name is Lucky. You know why you're here. We're here to chat about the sport that you and I love. So all and everything that we want to talk about starts at the race start. Lando gets a decent getaway. However, he does give Max a little bit of a sniff down on the inside for turn 1. Why would anyone do that to Max? Max judges that turn, the dive bomb, into perfection, mixes that with effective aggression, and just barely keeps 2 wheels on the track whilst he pushes Lando out, his main title contender, and overtakes Lando into turn 1. What does an opportunistic Charles Leclerc do? He got a wonderful race start, wonderful launch off the line. He overtakes Sainz, who starts in 3rd, gets a decent wide entry into turn 1, and sweeps by from 4th to 1st, taking the lead of the race. Lando goes from start to 4th, Charles goes from 4th to 1st, Max goes from 2nd to 2nd, and Sainz continues to push Max all the way until the end of lap 1. That sets the tone for the Austin GP, and that pretty much dictates the contention for the win. We'll get into other sub-threads later in the video. However, in terms of race start, Lewis also managed to get a really good start, jumped 5 positions up, but that was pretty short-lived. We'll talk about that very shortly. George, ultimately, because of his crash in qualifying, because Mercedes did not have a second set of upgrades, they had to revert back to an older spec, which meant that parc fermé rules were broken and George had to start from the pit lane. Although, despite starting from the pit lane with the right strategy, starting on the hards, Mercedes did manage to get George at least a 6th position finish, and also overtaking Sergio, who did start in the top 10. We'll chat about Sergio's performances later in the video as well, right? As we dive deeper into the race, there were a fair few battles and there were a fair few storylines. I think the few highlights for me was the fact that Tsunoda and Colapinto managed to keep Sergio behind them for a fair few laps, which ultimately could have hurt his race. But it did show that the new talent, or the seasoned RB talent in the name of Tsunoda, is definitely focused on getting that top seed for next year and making a statement. Tsunoda did not ultimately get the opportunity to outshine Lawson, who potentially got the better of the strategy, and because Tsunoda did get a 5-second penalty, Lawson ended up in the points, and Tsunoda losing out in terms of that battle at the start. It was a pretty interesting statement for Lawson to make, given that he did have 60-odd place grid penalty as well, and ultimately Lawson had a pretty cracker of a start in terms of his comeback to F1 on his first race with a back of the grid start. He managed to gain points and beating his teammate. That said, moving on to Colapinto, another wonderful race from the kid. In a track that he is not familiar with, he managed to out-qualify Albon and outscore Albon. Yes, Albon did have some challenges at the race start, especially with the controlled kind of dive bomb that Lewis did. He tangled with the Alpine and therefore lost a fair few places, but that you could attribute to the fact that he didn't qualify up ahead enough so that he could have avoided these things, right? So ultimately, I think over the weekend, Colapinto was there or thereabouts in qualifying, and sometimes out qualifying Albon, and also pretty good in race pace. And then talking about the Haas, I think the car was pretty good over the course of the weekend, and both Magnussen and Hulk was definitely in contention for points. And for a change, over the course of this weekend, Hulk was relatively out-qualified by Magnussen. This was about 8 races post the last race that K-Mag actually managed to out-qualify Hulk, right? But that said, Magnussen did have some issue in the car, and therefore he did fall out of contention for points, whereas Hulk managed to grab that 8th spot and consolidating their position in the constructors as the 6th, outscoring the RBs, right? So as we go up the grid, then comes Perez. So Perez finished 7th, which is, I think, not what Red Bull wants, right? So now Red Bull is ever closer to falling off the 2nd spot in the Constructors' Championship. Perez started in the top 10, and as I mentioned before, was overtaken by potentially or arguably a slower car in the hands of George Russell compared to the Red Bull. Because if you compare the race pace between Verstappen and the Mercedes, I don't necessarily think Mercedes was faster than the Red Bull on the day, but I think George managed to overtake Perez starting from the pit lane. So moving on to George, finished 6th. I think it was a wonderful drive. Yes, the strategy did work, starting on the hards versus the mediums. That does kind of taking a little detour into the tires fiasco, right? As we started the race, I think the strategy that was recommended from Pirelli was always a two-stopper, but even the folks running on mediums could go way into more than halfway the distance. Like Norris pitted in lap 31 out of 56 and still managed to do decent lap times at that point in time. So a two-stopper strategy from Pirelli was definitely out of whack, and I think maybe that threw some of the teams off, but no one really committed to a two-stop. And with starting on the hard tire at a high fuel load, naturally supported some of those strategy decisions apart from the front runners. So yes, the strategy in terms of tire did play into the hands of George Russell, but I think ultimately the fact that Perez was overtaken by someone who started at the grid wasn't necessarily what Red Bull ultimately would look forward to, right? So as we go up this grid, Piastri finished 5th. I think it's a pretty suboptimal race for him. He didn't really have the right quali pace. That may be because the McLaren's upgrades disturbed somewhat of the balance that the folks were comfortable in the name of Lando and Piastri, and potentially Lando was able to outdrive the car, whereas Piastri felt relatively uncomfortable and the confidence was low. So this is one of the things that we might need to look forward to the next 2 races, right? So would McLaren be able to unlock more performance and take the right strides towards gaining more performance, or would they start to see these challenges that the other teams have seen in terms of correlation, right? Ferrari saw that mid-season. Red Bull has started to see that over the course of majority of the second 2/3 of this season, and then Mercedes have been struggling with that since the ground effect rules came in since 2020, and it's really been McLaren that has only had this relatively upward trajectory with these big bulk update packages, but it didn't necessarily seem to be the case, and there was not a lot of chatter to say that the upgrades had worked and whether they've unlocked X percentage in terms of lap time. So one to look forward to and see. We come to pretty much the nail-biting moments of this race, really, right? So Max, ultimately from lap 1, he managed to defend Sainz over the course of the first few laps. However, because Sainz seemed to have had a problem in terms of power, he mentioned that the car smells like fuel a couple of times. So I think he had to take a fair few seconds off of that pace and maintain a relative gap to avoid the hot air and the disturbed air, so that 1, he maintains his tires, and 2, also temperatures. So it did give Max the opportunity to kind of settle into second. However, by Ferrari executing a very decent strategy, they were able to undercut Max, stop early, and then gain track position. And I think track position was pretty much everything in the race. That said, I do think even if Sainz were to come behind Max in the second stint, they would have potentially had the opportunity and the speed to overtake Max. That meant that despite the Pirelli 2-pit strategy, Max ends up behind Sainz, and the only opportunity that Lando had, if they were going to be able to take any points out of Max's championship lead, was to go long and build a tire delta, right? So Lando goes pretty long on the mediums, way beyond the half the race mark. So he pits on lap 31 and creates about a 6-lap delta, which brings him about 6 seconds behind Max. And with about 13 to 14 laps, Lando does catch up to Max, and in the dirty air, he doesn't necessarily have enough of an overspeed and closing speed in the DRS zone to overtake Max before the corner. And as we all know, Max does a wonderful job positioning the car, despite telling GP that his front tires are dead and he's having challenges in terms of turning, right? But Max's defense was almost flawless lap after lap for over about 10 laps. And then come lap 52, Lando gets his final chance to actually go relatively early into the second DRS zone and the corner. However, again, Max is in the inside and he pushes Lando completely out. Both of them do go outside of the track limits. Lando and McLaren decide to keep the position and not give the position back. And Max was very vocal in the team radio. But ultimately, I think McLaren made a decision for two reasons. One, they thought that they had the speed to create a 5-second gap. Even if Lando was to gain a 5-second penalty, then he would still maintain the position. And number two, they actually thought Lando was ahead at the apex and he was entitled to the corner, and therefore Max pushed him off the track. So despite for those two reasons, Lando does get a 5-second penalty and he was only able to pull away 4 seconds. If it was me, I think I would have taken the more conservative approach, directly given the position back, and then try and overtaken Max again in the next 3 laps or so until the race end, right? However, this raised a fair few questions. Lando does say at the post-race interview that he did stand by his decision, and there are inconsistencies in terms of these judgments, right? So Russell got a 5-second penalty for going inside and relatively pushing Bottas outside. Max, on the other hand, was also on the inside and he did push Lando outside of the track, right? So yes, Max has less to lose. So if Max has the opportunity to go extremely aggressive, he can go, because even if he does crash, he'd still be minimizing the points loss ultimately, right? Whereas Lando does have to be the more conservative driver. So there were inconsistencies in terms of how the penalties were handed out. However, I can't say Max was at fault at that corner, because the defense was wonderful. He managed to stop the car at the apex. Yes, both of them did go in, but saying that Lando was ahead at the apex was not necessarily true. At least I can't see that from the footage. I'm pretty sure some of you guys do see that, but if you guys do see that, and comment below who do you think is at fault, right? But I think that this is just true racing. That's what Andrea Stella also mentioned at the end of the race, right? I do understand on the other side that if you do continue to do these things, that you might not be penalized and therefore you might not necessarily drive by respective rules. But there is truly inconsistencies in terms of how penalties are handed out even within the race. And even if you go back to like 2021 Brazil, where Max kind of pushed out Lewis in terms of the Brazilian Grand Prix and no one got a penalty, right? So I think there should be some clarification there so that the drivers also understand how they should drive. But in this case, I don't personally see anyone at fault, and I think it was a disruption for actual form of racing, ultimately cherished for about 10 odd laps. But long story short, that was the fight for the last place at the podium, but the day belongs to Ferrari. Sainz ultimately was the better Ferrari over the course of the weekend, and I do think that he drove almost a flawless race, but Charles just jumping him at the start pretty much dictated everything. So Carlos drove a great race. His moves during the sprint weekend and the sprint race was wonderful. He also deserved a race win, but I think it was an equivalently good drive to Charles. So a 1-2 finish for Ferrari, and finally Charles' drive was an absolute champ's drive, right? So it was opportunistic, well controlled, and he did not break a sweat, figuratively, as he went down to the last lap and the checkered flag. And the best part, I also think that Ferrari as a team has started to fire on all cylinders. The strategy was wonderful in terms of stopping Carlos early to get track position. They covered for any opportunities. The pit stops are very quick. They seem to have the directions and the plans all in order. They seem to be starting to come up as the well-oiled machine that we started to see what Red Bull was over the course of the last few races, or last few seasons rather. So I know this is premature, but I get the feeling that Ferrari might be a new force of dominance for the rest of the season and potentially into next year. So looking at the Constructors' Championship, McLaren, Red Bull and Ferrari are definitely in contention for the championship. Between the three teams, they're really split by 48 points. And especially between Red Bull and Ferrari, they're only 8 points of a difference. And with the rate that Sergio is going, I think it's going to be a Red Bull third place if Ferrari continues this trajectory. And it's funny that Ferrari was the only outlier over the course of this weekend to have not brought an upgrade. They're still reaping the benefits from the Singapore package, and they have much more, or a few more items to come in the upcoming races. And if they continue to edge out the other teams, they can potentially be in contention for the fight. Mercedes ultimately, I think, have settled in at fourth. They're 200 points away from championship contention. On the midfield battle, Aston Martin definitely has consolidated themselves as the top of the midfield. Haas, I think, is starting to consolidate that sixth position this week, especially with Hulk outscoring VCARB and only Lawson scoring for VCARB. They've added 2 points to that gap between VCARB. Williams slowly solidifying themselves as the 8th fastest car. I don't necessarily think they have enough races to catch up to VCARB. And Alpine and Sauber, I think, are going to be the bottom of the pile. Although this weekend there were quite a few shimmers of hope for Alpine. Gasly started pretty well in terms of his grid position. However, in the second stint he fell back. That said, we'll have to see what the next races are gonna bring in. Moving on to the Drivers' Championship. Well, let's be honest, that's what we all care about. Max and Lando. Now there's a 57-point gap. Max actually added on 5 points to his championship lead over the course of this weekend, where we started by saying the main thing that Lando needs to do, if he does have an opportunity, is win and do everything right, and he did not do that over the course of this weekend. It almost feels like Max is going to definitely take away the championship. It's going to be a mammoth task to turn off 57 points. It would be the biggest points gap in the history of F1 since 1950, right? But that said, if Charles has the opportunity in terms of continuing this pace into the next 5 races, there might be an end to the Drivers' Championship with Max and Charles finishing second as opposed to Lando. Apart from that, not a lot of changes in terms of the Drivers' Championship. Colapinto does beat Ocon to 18th position with his new points tally on. Lawson comes into the Drivers' Championship as a point scorer, and poor Zhou and Valtteri still outside of points. And Nick finally cracks the top 10, pushing Lance out into 11th position. The overall race, I think in terms of banger drivers, I think definitely Leclerc and Sainz. we got to give an honorable mention to Colapinto and Lawson. In terms of blunders, I never thought I was going to say this, but Hamilton and Perez. In terms of bangers and blunders, in terms of teams, I think banger teams, definitely Ferrari. As I mentioned before, they were firing in all cylinders. And in terms of blunders, I got to go with Mercedes. Seems like they've relatively thought that they've brought a upgrade package, but they definitely didn't find the right balance in the car and created these issues for both drivers to create a loss of confidence that ultimately resulted them in pretty costly mistakes, right? Going home with just 8 points over the course of the weekend, where they were pretty optimistic in the package, is not necessarily what they would have wanted. And wrapping up with race rating, in terms of track action, that race delivered. It's a 9 out of 10 for me. In terms of strategy, there was not a lot. Despite Pirelli again saying that it's a 2-stopper, I don't think there was a lot in terms of strategy to play out. It's a 6. In terms of competitiveness, it was brilliant to see a shuffled up grid, both in terms of quali pace and also race pace. Yes, Ferrari was relatively the fastest car, but they did have to work for it because their quali pace wasn't necessarily there. So 8 out of 10 for competitiveness, and fans, I'm going to give a 7. So that wraps up a race rating of 7.5 for the Austin GP. I can't wait for the second of this triple header. If you guys haven't subscribed already, hit that subscribe button, share this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace. Ciao.